It started with laughter, not mine but theirs. The kind of laughter that carries arrogance, the kind that makes your stomach twist because you know it's about you. I didn't realize it then, but that sound marked the beginning of a war I never asked for. A war that would end with locked gates, furious phone calls, and one sign that changed everything. You see, the cabin wasn't just a property. It was my grandmother's legacy, a slice of quiet land tucked behind the pines, built board by her hands and mine. For years it stood untouched, peaceful, and private. But peace has a way of attracting the kind of people who can't stand it. The kind who look at your land and see rules, boundaries, and leverage. And in this community, those people had 3 letters stitched into their power. HOA, it started small. Whispers about upkeep, notes about property standards, little reminders that didn't quite sound like suggestions. Then came the knock on the door, polite, smiling, and full of poison. They said they were there to help maintain harmony, but I could see it in their eyes. This wasn't about harmony. It was about control. Weeks later, I'd find out what they'd really been planning. By the time I drove up that gravel path and saw strangers walking across my yard, clipboards in hand, cameras clicking, the truth hit like a gut punch. A real estate agent stood in the driveway, telling someone about the perfect cabin getaway for sale. My cabin, my land. My name still on the deed. The sign out front read, "For sale." But it wasn't mine, and that was the moment something in me changed. I wasn't just defending property anymore. I was defending history, memory, and blood. They thought they could push me, silence me, even sell me off. But they forgot one thing. Paper works both ways, because when they opened that gate without asking, they had no idea what kind of door they'd just stepped through. So tell me, how far would you go when someone tries to sell the land your family built with their own hands? The cabin sat at the end of a narrow gravel road, surrounded by pine and silence. It wasn't fancy, not the kind of home you'd see in glossy real estate magazines, or the kind that made people whisper money under their breath. But it was honest, weathered wood, a rust-colored tin roof, and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. To me, it was more than a building. It was a heartbeat that had pulsed through my family for generations. My grandmother built it herself, with neighbors from a time when people helped each other, because that's what you did. She left it to me, trusting I'd keep it safe, keep it ours. And I did, for years. The land stretched just shy of an acre, not big enough to farm, not small enough to ignore. Behind the cabin was a small stream, one that caught the morning light like liquid glass. In spring, the wildflowers turned the ground into a living painting. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that healed you. That was until the day the new HOA started expanding its borders. At first, it seemed harmless. The Pine Hollow Community Association had always existed, just not here. They managed the cluster of modern homes that sat about a mile downhill, all fresh siding and perfect lawns. The kind of place where every porch light matched, and the mailboxes stood in neat little rows like soldiers. They had bylaws, fees, committees, a whole system to ensure community consistency. I never paid it much mind. After all, my cabin sat outside their jurisdiction. Or at least, that's what I thought. The trouble began the year the board changed leadership. Out went the older, milder crowd who saw Pine Hollow as a friendly collective. In came a new wave, the self-appointed revitalizers. They were the kind of people who looked at rules like weapons and structure like status. The new president, a woman named Elaine Kirkwood, ran everything with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was in her late 40s, dressed like she was always headed to a meeting that never ended, pressed blazers, pearl earrings, and that clipped tone that made everything sound like an order disguised as a favor. Elaine was joined by her loyal second, Martin Cobb, a retired contractor who treated the HOA bylaws like scripture. He was broad-shouldered and loud, with a permanent squint and a handshake that lingered too long. A man who believed authority meant volume. Then there was Tracy Nguyen, the treasurer, quiet but calculating, with the uncanny ability to recall exact fee amounts from memory. She didn't say much, but when she did, you listened, because she always spoke with paperwork to back it up. The last two board members were more performative than powerful. George, the self-proclaimed landscape expert, and Sandy, the social chair who organized mandatory fun with a kind of forced cheerfulness that made your skin crawl. Together, they formed a circle of control, one that thrived on microaggression, gossip, and letters written in the kind of legal tone that always started with per Section 4A of the Community Covenant. It started subtly. The first letter wasn't even threatening. It came folded neatly inside my mailbox with the Pine Hollow emblem embossed at the top. It read like a welcome note, full of polite flattery. "We're expanding the community to include adjacent properties," it said, "and we're thrilled to have you as part of our neighborhood family." At the time, I laughed. My cabin wasn't part of any expansion. The land was private, deeded before Pine Hollow even existed. My grandmother's signature still sat on the original documents, long before Elaine's manicured hands started stapling rules to lampposts. But I kept the letter anyway, a reminder of how quietly control begins. The first red flag came 2 weeks later when I found a white SUV idling near my gate. A man in a reflective vest was taking photos of the cabin, the gate, even the mailbox. When I stepped out, he waved like it was nothing, muttering something about property surveys. The SUV had the Pine Hollow logo on the side. That night, I noticed a new sign at the bottom of the hill. "Welcome to Pine Hollow Estates, a deed-restricted community." It wasn't my sign. Neighbors began changing, too. The couple across the road, quiet retirees named the Jensens, suddenly stopped waving. George from the board started showing up unannounced, commenting on how wild my trees looked. He said things like, "If you trimmed those back, your property value would go up." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. Disguised as concern, Elaine sent her first official notice of non-compliance in late May. It accused me of violating landscaping standards and not maintaining visual harmony. It was absurd. My property wasn't even on their map. I called her office. She said it must have been a clerical error. The next week, I got another one. This time, the notice mentioned potential penalties. That's when I started documenting everything. Photos, copies, dates. My grandmother's deed was locked in a fireproof box in the cabin, her old handwriting still looping across the pages. Every time I read it, I could almost hear her voice. Steady, certain, defiant. "This land is ours. Don't ever let them take it." Still, there was part of me that wanted to believe this could all be cleared up with a conversation. So when Elaine invited me to the next HOA meeting to clarify boundaries, I went. It was held in the Pine Hollow Clubhouse, a sterile, over-decorated space that smelled like air freshener and self-importance. Elaine sat at the front of the room behind a folding table stacked with papers. Her smile was tight when she saw me. Around her sat the other board members, all flipping through binders like they were preparing for trial. The meeting began with pleasantries, budget reports, landscaping updates, and Tracy's monotone recitation of monthly dues compliance. Then came my name. Elaine turned to me, her voice dripping with false warmth. "We just wanted to address the matter of your property inclusion. It seems there's been some confusion regarding the updated zoning boundaries." She pushed a paper toward me, a printed map with a red line drawn around the Pine Hollow Estates. My cabin sat just inside that line. I studied the map. It was recent, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The boundary line cut through the forest, over the creek, and right across my property. "That line's wrong," I said. "This cabin isn't under HOA jurisdiction. Always has been private." Elaine's smile didn't waver. "Well," she said smoothly, "sometimes boundaries evolve with community growth. We're all part of something bigger now, aren't we?" There was a murmur from the other members, nods, polite smirks. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a claim. When I refused to sign their acknowledgement form, Elaine's tone hardened. "I understand this is emotional for you," she said, but compliance ensures fairness for everyone." Fairness. That word rang in my ears like an insult. After the meeting, Martin followed me out to the parking lot. "You could make this easy on yourself," he said, leaning on my truck. "Join in, pay the dues. Keep things smooth." His breath smelled of coffee and condescension. "Otherwise, you might find this place gets harder to maintain. Lots of regulations around these parts." I didn't answer. I just started the engine and drove back up the hill, watching his reflection fade in the rearview mirror. For a few weeks, nothing happened. Then came the fines. Small at first, $50 for exterior neglect, $75 for unapproved fencing. The letters were worded like threats dressed up as paperwork. I ignored them. But when I tried to renew my property insurance, the agent mentioned something strange. The HOA had listed my address under their managed community properties. They were tightening the net. Neighbors began whispering. One morning, I found a note pinned to my gate. "You're making things harder for everyone. Just sign the forms. No signature, just printed letters." Another day, I caught Sandy taking photos of my shed. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said, "Oh, Elaine asked me to gather some documentation for the newsletter." By midsummer, I'd stopped waving back, but despite the tension, I still tried to hold on to the rhythm of my life. Mornings on the porch, tending the garden, fixing what broke. I told myself it would pass, but then something shifted. I started hearing rumors, quiet ones, about a development project. Elaine had been boasting about expanding Pine Hollow's portfolio to include rustic properties with recreational potential. That's when the surveyor came back. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 3 people walked the property line, measuring tape and notepads in hand. They didn't see me watching from the window. I waited until they left, then followed the flags they'd staked into the ground. The last one stopped near the edge of the creek, where an old boundary marker stood half buried under moss. The marker was original, my grandmother's, carved with her initials. That night, I pulled the deed out of its box and stared at the words, tracing the line that defined the property's edge. Every inch was accounted for. Every boundary was legal. Yet somehow Elaine and her board had convinced themselves that rewriting reality was just part of community management. And deep down, I knew. This was just the beginning. The line between a neighborhood and a battlefield was about to disappear. The morning after the surveyors came, the air felt different, thicker somehow. When I stepped outside, dew still clinging to the grass, I could hear it. The faint hum of distant conversation, the low idle of an engine that didn't belong. I followed the sound to the end of the gravel drive, and there it was again, that same white SUV, but this time it wasn't alone. A second car, dark gray, sat beside it. 2 men were leaning against the hood, clipboards in hand, pretending not to see me. They didn't wave. They didn't even look up. That was the day the first real escalation began. It started with the letters. Not 1 or 2, but a flood. Every morning for a week I found new envelopes stacked in my mailbox, each one more aggressive than the last. Violation notice, unauthorized structure. Fine issued, improper. Landscaping. Warning, failure to comply. With HOA Ordinance 7B, they came printed on heavy stock paper with the HOA emblem stamped in blue. At first, I laughed it off. They couldn't enforce anything on property that wasn't theirs. But after the 5th notice, I started to notice the details. Each fine included photos, taken from angles that could only come from someone standing on my land. My porch, my fence, even my shed. The total fines by the end of that first week came to $1,250. I tried calling Elaine again, but her assistant answered, a chirpy voice that sounded like it had been trained to deflect conflict. "Elaine's in a board session," she said. "If you'd like to contest the notices, you can submit a formal appeal by mail." An appeal to an HOA I didn't belong to. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. But the laughter didn't last long. That same week, someone trimmed the edge of my property line, the stretch of trees that separated my land from the main road. They didn't just trim, they butchered. The once thick wall of green that gave me privacy was hacked down to knee height, leaving an ugly scar of raw stumps. I found a laminated notice nailed to one of the remaining trunks. Vegetation overgrowth corrected in accordance with HOA Landscaping Standard 3A. They'd done it without permission, without warning. When I confronted George, the so-called landscaping expert, he just smiled. "Oh, you're welcome," he said. "We noticed your lot was obstructing the sightline for community visibility. Had to step in before it became a hazard." "Visibility?" I asked, my voice low. "Community safety," he replied, the words rolling off his tongue like a rehearsed speech. "Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt." That night, I sat on my porch staring at the raw, open space where my trees once stood. The sound of cars drifted up from the main road, headlights cutting through the darkness that had once been hidden. I didn't sleep much after that. Every crunch of gravel made me flinch. Then, the garbage incident happened. A new notice appeared, this one accusing me of improper waste management. According to the HOA, trash bins had to be community-approved models, placed no more than 18 inches from the curb between the hours of 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. on designated collection days. I didn't even have curbside pickup. The county handled mine, privately. Yet, somehow, I'd been fined another $200 for non-compliance. By mid-June, it was clear this wasn't about paperwork or property lines. It was about breaking me down, piece by piece. Everywhere I turned, there was a new problem. The mailbox got vandalized, the flag snapped off, and the inside smeared with mud. My water pressure suddenly dropped, later traced to a valve someone had half closed outside near the meter. And one morning, as I walked down to collect the mail, I found a printed flyer taped to my gate. Community integrity depends on cooperation. Don't be that neighbor. No name, no logo. Just those words in bold black type. I started keeping a log. Every noise, every visit, every car that idled too long near the property. The list grew faster than I could keep up with. Then came the inspection. It was early July, humid and heavy. I was sanding down the porch rail when I heard footsteps. Not one pair, but several. I turned and saw 3 people walking up the path, Elaine, Martin, and George. No notice, no permission. They carried clipboards and a camera, like they were there to appraise something that didn't belong to them. "Morning," Elaine chirped, her tone syrupy sweet. "We're here to conduct a property inspection for compliance verification." "You're trespassing," I said, my voice steady but tight. Elaine blinked like I'd said something absurd. "As members of the community board, we have authorization to ensure standards are being met." "This isn't your jurisdiction," I snapped. "Get off my property." Martin stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "Sir, we're just doing our job." "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I said, "Get off." For a moment, no one moved. Then George clicked a few photos, muttering something about documentation. My heart was pounding. I could feel the blood rising in my ears, the fury clawing up my throat. When I took a step toward them, Elaine finally sighed, closing her folder. "Fine," she said. "But understand, non-cooperation only makes this worse for you." They left without another word. But later that evening, I found a new notice in my mailbox. "Failure to permit inspection, fine, $500. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was war. Over the next month, the harassment deepened. Tracy from the board started sending reminders about upcoming fees. Martin began parking near the end of my drive, claiming he was checking for code compliance. Neighbors I barely knew started whispering when I passed. One even asked, half-jokingly, "When are you finally going to fix that eyesore of a fence?" Word had spread, Elaine's kind of word, the kind that dripped poison one drop at a time. Then, one afternoon, a letter came from the county assessor's office. It wasn't from the HOA, it was official. It stated that Pine Hollow Estates had filed an update claiming administrative inclusion of my property under their management for taxation and maintenance purposes. Someone, likely Elaine, had submitted the paperwork. I spent 3 days in offices, showing proof, citing records, waving my grandmother's deed like a shield. The clerk, a tired man in his 60s, finally sighed and said, "You got a mess here. Looks like someone's trying to redraw parcel lines through a community petition. It's rare, but not impossible. Not impossible." When I got home, I found my gate open. My toolshed door hung ajar. Nothing seemed stolen, but everything inside had been disturbed. Boxes shifted, drawers open, papers on the floor. Near the window, written in the thin layer of dust, were 3 words: "Sign the papers." That night, the storm came. Thunder cracked across the hills, wind whipping through the shredded tree line. The power flickered twice before cutting out entirely. I sat in the dark, flashlight in hand, listening. Somewhere outside, gravel crunched. I froze. Through the window, I caught a flicker of light, a flashlight beam moving across the yard. I stepped quietly to the door and peered out. The beam danced across the porch before snapping away. When the storm passed, I found muddy boot prints near the steps. 3 sets. The next morning, Elaine called. Her voice was smooth as ever. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "We noticed some unusual activity near your property last night. Everything all right?" I said nothing. "You know," she continued, "this kind of tension could all go away if you just formalize your membership. It's really just paperwork." Her tone carried the kind of quiet threat that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I hung up without replying. The fines kept coming. $200 for noise disturbance after the storm. $350 for unapproved exterior repairs. $125 for improper lighting fixture. They were inventing new violations out of thin air. My mailbox overflowed with threats of collections, lien consideration, and community arbitration. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. The emotional toll began to show. Sleep came in fragments. My appetite vanished. Every sound outside felt suspicious. I stopped using the front porch entirely. The once peaceful cabin that had been my sanctuary now felt like a siege post. One afternoon, a drone buzzed over the property, low, loud, intrusive. It hovered for a moment near the shed before zipping away. When I looked online later that evening, I found aerial photos of my cabin posted in a Pine Hollow Facebook group under a caption that read, "Unregistered property still refusing to comply." Not very neighborly, is it? The comments were worse. People I'd never met calling me selfish, stubborn, toxic. Some said I was bringing down the value of the neighborhood. Others joked about teaching me a lesson. I didn't reply. But something inside me hardened. The next escalation came with the fence. A week later, I came home from town to find 3 men tearing down part of it, the section nearest the main road. When I ran over demanding to know what they were doing, one held up a clipboard. "Order from Pine Hollow HOA," he said. "Fence violates sightline regulation. We're authorized to adjust for community safety." "Authorized by who?" I shouted. He just shrugged. "Take it up with the board." They left a pile of broken wood and another laminated notice flapping in the wind. That night, I printed copies of my deed, the original property map, every photo, every letter, and every fine. I started compiling it all into a single binder, evidence. If they were going to keep coming, I'd be ready. But readiness didn't stop what came next. A week later, I got a knock at the door. 2 uniformed men, not police, but county enforcement officers. They carried papers. Elaine had filed a community maintenance complaint, claiming my property was unsafe and unsanitary, requesting a forced inspection. I let them in. I had nothing to hide. They walked the grounds, noted everything, took photos, and left. Days later, I received the report. No violations found. But the damage was done. My address was now officially tagged in the county system as under review. Elaine had gotten what she wanted, a mark on my record. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread that I planned to show up. I walked in with my binder under my arm, heart pounding, camera rolling on my phone. Elaine smiled like she'd been expecting me. "Ah, our special guest," she said, her tone dripping with mock kindness. I stood in front of the room, opened my binder, and began reading. The letters, the trespasses, the fake fines, the survey flags, the vandalism. I showed them photos, proof. Elaine interrupted, her voice calm but cold. "Sir, this isn't the proper forum for personal grievances." "This isn't personal," I shot back. "This is harassment," the room murmured. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Martin crossed his arms, glaring. Elaine gave me that same tight smile, then said softly, "Perhaps we should take this discussion offline. We wouldn't want to cause unnecessary conflict in front of your neighbors, but that was the point, wasn't it? To make me look like the problem." When I left, I could feel their eyes on me. Elaine's car idled as I passed. Her window rolled down just enough for her voice to slip through. "You can fight this," she said. "But every day you resist, it gets worse. Think about that." And she was right. It did get worse. A week later, the county assessor called again. Another update to the parcel lines had been submitted, this time with new documentation attached. Someone had forged a signature, mine. It wasn't perfect, but close enough to cause confusion. The clerk said an investigation would be opened, but those things take time. I felt my grip on control slipping. What Elaine and her board couldn't take through law, they were trying to rewrite through persistence. Every day a new battle. Every week a new letter. I tried contacting a lawyer, but the moment I mentioned HOA disputes, most backed off. They've got resources, one said. It's a long fight, but it wasn't just legal anymore. It was psychological. The intimidation, the isolation, the slow erosion of peace. I started to question everything. I'd catch my own reflection in the window at night and barely recognize the person staring back. And yet, I couldn't give up. This was my grandmother's land. Her handwriting still on that old deed, her voice echoing in my mind. Don't let them take it. So I decided to turn the tables. I began recording everything. The cars, the meetings, the visits. I installed cameras at the gate, near the shed, along the tree line. I even caught George trespassing one evening, holding a tape measure and muttering something about setback violations. I sent the footage to the county sheriff's office. They opened a report, but warned me, HOAs operate in gray areas. Be careful, careful. As if I hadn't been, then came the breaking point, the letter that made my blood run cold. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. According to the document, Pine Hollow HOA intended to place a lien against my property for unpaid fines and fees, totaling over $8,000. It was a lie, but a dangerous one. Liens could freeze accounts, delay sales, damage credit. I called Elaine, my voice shaking. You don't have the right, I said. Oh, but we do, she replied sweetly. You're part of Pine Hollow now, whether you like it or not. And as her words hung in the air, I realized this wasn't just a fight over property. It was about power, control, and erasure. They wanted me gone, but if they thought I was going quietly, they were wrong. Because somewhere deep in the anger, something shifted. The fear burned off, leaving only resolve. I started making calls to reporters, investigators, even other homeowners who'd fought similar battles. And what I found made everything clear. Elaine had done this before. There were others. Families who'd been pressured out, intimidated, fined into foreclosure. All so the HOA could revitalize their land for profit. And I promised myself, this time, she'd pick the wrong person because I wasn't leaving. Not without a fight, not without the truth, and not before the whole world knew exactly what Pine Hollow was hiding. The morning the showdown began, the world felt unnervingly calm, the kind of quiet that hums just before a storm breaks. The air was still thick with the weight of something inevitable. I woke early, long before the sun climbed the ridge, and stood at the window overlooking the scarred stretch of my land. The trees were gone, the fence broken, the ground damp from last night's rain. Everything the HOA had tried to strip from me, my privacy, my peace, my dignity, seemed to stare back in that ruined landscape. But beneath it all was something they hadn't managed to touch yet. Resolve. Cold, absolute resolve. That morning, I wasn't the same man they'd been toying with for months. I'd been humiliated, fined, threatened, even invaded. But every wound had hardened me into someone sharper, quieter, more dangerous. And today was the day it all turned. It started just after 9. The sound of engines drifted up the road, followed by the glint of polished bumpers through the thinning trees. A convoy of cars, some silver sedans, a black SUV, and at the back a county vehicle. The HOA board, dressed for battle, stepped out like generals arriving at a conquered field. Elaine, in her immaculate white blazer, walked at the front, clipboard in hand, flanked by Martin and George. Behind them came 2 men in suits, lawyers probably, and a uniformed county inspector. Elaine smiled the moment she saw me, that same rehearsed grin that had haunted my mailbox for months. "Morning," she called, her voice carrying across the gravel. "We're here to conduct the formal assessment and enforcement procedures for Pine Hollow compliance." "You were notified." Notified? As if a forged lien notice counted as proper warning. I didn't move. I stood on my porch, arms folded, silent. Behind me, on the table inside, my laptop was recording. 2 hidden cameras, one by the gate, one in the window, captured everything. Elaine took a few steps forward. Now we can do this the easy way or we can escalate. You've had plenty of chances to resolve your outstanding violations. I let the words hang there. For months, she'd talked in threats masked as courtesy, in bureaucratic venom dressed as civility. But this time, her voice trembled just enough to betray something new: uncertainty. "Elaine," I finally said, my tone steady, "you're trespassing. Again," she laughed lightly, gesturing to the inspector. "Actually, we're not. The county approved our administrative inclusion request weeks ago. Your property is officially within Pine Hollow's jurisdiction now." I tilted my head. "That's interesting," I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket. "Because I just came from the county office yesterday." I unfolded the document, a stamped letter signed by the county assessor himself. "Your request was denied, permanently." The inspector's eyebrows twitched. Elaine blinked, the first real crack in her composure. "That's impossible," she said quickly. "There must be a mistake." "No," I replied. "The mistake was yours. You forged documents, submitted falsified maps, and tried to rewrite property lines that haven't changed in over 50 years. A ripple went through the group. Martin stepped forward, trying to reclaim control. "You can't prove that," he said. "Oh, but I can." I turned back toward the porch and hit a button on the laptop. From a small speaker, a voice began to play, Elaine's voice. Clear, measured. Recorded 2 weeks ago during a phone call she hadn't realized I was recording. Her words echoed across the clearing. "Once it's absorbed, he won't have any leverage left. We can claim noncompliance and file the lien. It's how we handled the others." Every syllable landed like a hammer blow. The inspector froze. The lawyers exchanged glances. Elaine's face drained of color, her lips parting slightly in disbelief. You recorded that?" she stammered. "I recorded everything," I said. "The trespasses, the illegal inspections, the forged documents, even your little meeting at the board office last Friday." From my pocket, I pulled another device, a small USB drive. "This," I said, "is a copy of everything I sent to the county attorney, the sheriff's department, and a journalist from Channel 8. Elaine's mask cracked completely. "You don't know what you've done," she hissed, stepping closer, her voice sharp with panic. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my board? You're finished." "Enough," interrupted the inspector, his tone cutting through the chaos. He turned to Elaine. "Ma'am, is there truth to this recording?" Her silence was answer enough. George shifted uncomfortably. Martin opened his mouth to defend her, but faltered when I spoke again. "You want proof?" "Look behind you." Everyone turned. Down the road, 2 more vehicles were approaching, this time county deputies. I'd called them that morning, sent them the files, and asked them to be present for safety reasons. They pulled up quietly, lights flashing once before cutting off. Elaine took a step back, her confidence collapsing with every heartbeat. The deputies approached the group, one of them speaking softly with the inspector. The tension was unbearable, the kind that feels like static crawling up your skin. Finally, the lead deputy turned to me. "Sir, we've received your evidence. We'll need to collect statements." Then to Elaine. "Ma'am, you're being asked to remain here while we review these allegations," she tried to argue. But the words died on her tongue. And in that moment, standing there on the porch of my grandmother's land, watching the same people who'd tormented me for months realize they weren't untouchable, something inside me broke loose. Not rage, not fear. Something else. Relief. Still, the drama wasn't over. While the deputies questioned Elaine and Martin, one of the lawyers quietly stepped away, phone in hand. Within minutes, the rest of the HOA board arrived, a parade of cars, worried faces, and frantic whispers. I watched them from a distance, their perfect little world beginning to unravel. But the real blow came later that afternoon. The county inspector called me aside, lowering his voice. "We've verified the paperwork," he said. "It appears the HOA filed multiple fraudulent claims over the last year, not just yours. At least 3 other properties were targeted. The county's opening an official investigation. By evening, word had spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, first cautiously, then curiously. People who'd avoided me for months now stood at their fences, murmuring in disbelief as deputies escorted Elaine and her 2 board members away for questioning. I didn't celebrate. Not yet, because even as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the wreckage of my yard, I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone they'd bullied, everyone who'd been too scared or too tired to fight back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the aftermath, piles of paperwork, the faint smell of rain, the sound of distant voices as news crews began setting up down the road. I stared at the binder that had started all of this, the evidence I'd built piece by piece, and felt something shift deep inside. Vindication, yes, but also something heavier, because in winning, I'd also seen the full ugliness of what power does to people when it goes unchecked. The next morning, I woke to chaos, not from the HOA this time, but from the community itself. Cars lined the streets, cameras flashing, reporters interviewing residents about the scandal at Pine Hollow. The once pristine entrance to the neighborhood now stood as a crime scene. Caution tape fluttering across the stone sign, Elaine's name was everywhere. Local news, online forums, even national HOA watchdog groups. Words like fraud, abuse of power, and malfeasance painted the headlines. But the real moment of catharsis came 3 days later at the emergency community meeting. The HOA's interim board, hastily assembled after Elaine's arrest, had called it to restore transparency. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with tension and gossip. I stood near the back, silent, as resident after resident took the microphone to share their stories. The fines, the intimidation, the silence they'd endured. Some cried, some shouted, some demanded resignations. When my name was called, the room fell quiet. I walked to the front, the echo of my footsteps filling the space. Faces I'd once only seen peeking through blinds now looked at me with something new. Respect, maybe even remorse. I didn't want a fight, I began. All I wanted was to live in peace on land that's been in my family for generations. But when people like Elaine abuse power, when they turn community into control, silence becomes surrender. I paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't just about me, I continued. It's about everyone who's been pushed, fined, or bullied into compliance for the sake of someone else's ego. You all know what it feels like, that slow, creeping fear that if you speak up, they'll come for you next. But it ends now, because the only thing stronger than their authority is our unity. The applause started small, hesitant, unsure, then grew, rising into something thunderous. By the time the meeting ended, the board had been dissolved. The county had seized the records. The HOA was effectively over. That night, I walked home under the quiet hum of streetlights, the air cool and sharp. For the first time in months, the road felt different, lighter somehow, like the weight had lifted off the entire neighborhood. I passed a few residents on their porches, and one older man nodded as I went by. About time someone stood up to them, he said softly. I smiled, just barely. Yeah, I murmured. About time. When I reached my gate, I stopped. The damage was still there, the broken fence, the stumps, the scattered gravel, but for once, I didn't see destruction. I saw proof. Proof that they hadn't won. Inside, I poured a cup of coffee and sat on the porch as dawn began to creep across the hills. The birds were back, faint, but steady. The fight had taken everything out of me. Time, sleep, peace, but in the silence that followed, something new had replaced it. Strength. I thought about my grandmother's voice again, that promise I'd made months ago when this all began. And as the first light hit the trees, I whispered it aloud. They'll never take this land. The world outside was still scarred, but it was mine again, and maybe, just maybe. Pine Hollow had learned what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Because some wars aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with truth, and in the end, truth always leaves a mark deeper than any fine ever could. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Pine Hollow's HOA, the entire neighborhood seemed to move through a strange kind of awakening. For years, people had walked with their heads down, lawn edges trimmed to regulation, shutters painted to code, living in quiet obedience to a handful of neighbors who called themselves a board. But once the mask slipped, once Elaine and her loyal enforcers were exposed for what they were, something broke loose in the air. Something electric, raw, and long overdue. The whispers turned to conversations. The conversations turned into meetings. And suddenly, the fear that had governed every front porch and every manicured lawn evaporated, replaced by something far more powerful: collective anger. The news spread quickly. Local outlets feasted on the story. HOA power scandal in Pine Hollow, board under investigation for fraud and harassment. What began as a neighborhood dispute had become a county-wide headline, then a regional story, then a symbol. I saw my own face on the news one night, blurred slightly, my voice distorted, as reporters described one homeowner's fight against HOA corruption. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold on the screen. Elaine was the first to face formal charges. The county's investigation uncovered a paper trail stretching back years: falsified inspection reports, fabricated fines, even embezzled community funds rerouted to a private account under her maiden name. Martin and George weren't far behind. Both had signed documents authorizing illegal liens on multiple properties, and both tried to claim ignorance. But ignorance doesn't hold up well under forensic accounting. Within a month, the entire Pine Hollow HOA board had been dissolved by court order, their assets frozen pending restitution. Neighbors who had once glared at me for leaving my trash can out too long now crossed the street to shake my hand. Some apologized, voices trembling with guilt or embarrassment. Others just nodded silently, their eyes saying what words couldn't. Thank you for doing what we were too scared to do. It wasn't instant healing. The damage ran deep, not just to the land or the finances, but to trust itself. For years, people had learned to flinch at authority, to live small to avoid attention. Undoing that kind of fear takes time. But change started showing up in quiet, unexpected ways. The first thing that went was the signage, those smug little reminders of control. No parking on street overnight. No decorative flags without approval. Grass height limit, 3 inches. They disappeared one by one, removed by residents under the soft glow of porch lights. No one needed to coordinate it. It just happened, as if everyone silently agreed that the rules no longer belonged here.